Good afternoon, everyone. It's Graham Coath with another My Music, and today I'm going to be talking to Justin from Sons of Southern Ulster. But first, this.
I need to get going, mate. I'll see you later.
All right, Justin, thanks for joining me. The last person that I had on, Alan Brown, wanted to buy one of those afterwards, so it must be a good advert.
Obviously worked with him. I don't even know what it was.
It's one of these. You could use it as a drumstick.
Oh yes, I need one of those.
Yeah, but actually, it's a laptop. It's a laptop stand.
Oh, I really do, because I'm leaning up against a box right now. So yes.
Well, there you go. There you go, and it actually gets your laptop to a decent height as well.
If the advertisers are listening, it's done its job.
It really has. So Justin, tell me, where did music begin with you, sir? And we will get on to why you're in another part of the world from which you were born in a minute, and maybe that will come out in the story. But where did music start for you?
I suppose when I think back to my youth, I'm in my mid-50s, and when I think back to sort of coming of age, and at the age of about probably 8 or 9, I think the first band I ever was sort of conscious of was probably the Bay City Rollers, who came to Dublin where I was living at the time, and I was very unhappy that I couldn't go to see them, even though they played in a place up the street. But that passed soon, and I sort of moved on to the whole sort of punk scene came in, and we were somewhat removed from it. But I remember a cousin of mine came over from London who was around my age. He was probably a year older one summer, and he had a cassette tape and a pair of Brothel Creepers. And on the cassette tape was one side was the Clash's first album, and the other side was the Sex Pistols' first album. And I remember we'd just sit in this shed at the back of my house for the 2 or 3 weeks that he was over. His mother would have been my father's sister, so they were Irish immigrants to London, and we just listened to this thing nonstop. And he told me all about the sort of punk thing, so that sort of got me sort of into that kind of scene. But I was living in a small town in Ireland at that time, so you didn't really have access to punk or bands or that kind of stuff. So you sort of took what you got. So it was kind of an eclectic education. So you had on one side you had what you'd see on TV and what you'd read about in magazines and stuff. But if you go to the local disco, they'd be playing, Status Quo and, that kind of stuff. And then bands would come. The band scene was, it was very much a show band scene, which was basically
right.
Bands that would come along and play covers, and they would play, the hits of the day. And they'd intersperse that with a few country and western numbers and maybe a few traditional acts. So it was this kind of eclectic mix, which was very boring at the time. I remember you'd sort of be looking down your nose at these people. But in retrospect, they were actually top-class musicians. And, they found a way to make money from their art, which you have to sort of respect now, because, I'd say there's a handful of bands around now who actually truly make money from their art, who aren't U2. So you have to respect that. But it was sort of an eclectic mix. But that was the start of it. And then later on, when I got a bit older and sort of got into my teens and early 20s, I started a band with some guys from the town that we lived in, which was Bailiver in County Cavan. And we took ourselves very seriously. Probably took ourselves too seriously. And
who were you aspiring to be as a group? Because especially when you're young, there's always one or two artists that you go, oh, I'd love to be like them.
Well, it would always change. If you remember, like, I living in America now, music sort of what's in and what's not in, it doesn't really change in America. America is like, you still have people who listen to the Beatles, and you still have people who listen to Pink Floyd and that kind of stuff. But if you remember, and I'm sure, I don't know if it's the same in Ireland or in England now, but things would change. So one week you'd be into, Duran Duran, and a week later you'd be into, the Sex Pistols or something like that. So I suppose to illustrate what kind of stuff we were listening to when we started this band was, we couldn't play our instruments, and that kind of classic punk kind of thing. Nobody. I was the singer, so that didn't really matter. And David was on guitar, and he couldn't really play. He was learning as we went along. And the first three covers that we did were this dates us too. It was "Should I Stay or Should I Go" by The Clash. It was "Rip It Up" by Orange Juice, and a song called "Thorn of Crowns" by Echo and the Bunnymen. So it was at that time that we started this band. And so we tried to do those. We did covers of them. They were absolutely terrible. And so we ended up doing our own stuff. So but that was kind of the sort of what started the band, was that kind of, I suppose, kind of punk, pop, post-punk thing. But as a band, we were, we didn't really know what we were doing, and we'd sort of change with the wind. And if we went and saw a band that we liked, we go, "Oh, let's try and copy that." And so we really didn't have an identity, and so we wrote our own songs and that kind of thing. And I wrote the lyrics, but in retrospect, it was all very naive and sort of idealistic, but not it was doomed to failure. Because we thought we were great, and we thought a record deal, which was the holy grail back then, was around the corner. But in retrospect, when I go back and listen to it, I kind of go, "God, those lyrics, I had no business."
What was the band called?
The Panic Merchants.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
And
it's a good name, actually. It's a good name.
Yeah, it was all right. I see there's another band. I looked at it a few years ago. You know the way you do, you sort of Google yourself to see if there's any trace of you out there. And it seems there's another band called the Panic Merchants. So I was going to get the lawyers onto them, but I figured I'd let it slide. It's been 30 years.
Yeah. So that was your foray into beginning to make music, and as you say, it was probably more of a social thing in some respects, and just seeing what you could do and noise and everything else. When did it get really serious for you?
Well, that was as serious as it got, because at that point I would say this.
Okay, when did it get less serious for you?
The late 80s is when the Panic Merchants, were in our heyday. So
right.
That was when we were we were drawing crowds in excess of 24. And we sort of thought we took ourselves seriously, as I say. We played a lot of gigs. We gigged around Dublin. We did all what you were supposed to do. And then at a certain point, it just kind of fizzled out, and we just stopped playing one day. There was no, we didn't break up or anything. There was no dramatic sort of musical differences or anything. We just stopped playing, and then sort of life got in the way. And not long after that, I moved to America, and none of us really did music after that. So when you say when did it get serious, we were never serious. We had other things going on in our lives. So sure. I moved to America, and I didn't really think about music for probably about 20 years. And I suppose what sort of got me back into it was what my parents died, around 10 years ago. And I began to kind of think about these things, and I began to sort of think, oh, well, we always wanted to put out a 7-inch single, which we never did. We put out a cassette single, if you remember such a thing.
Of course I do.
I've been kicking myself about it ever since, because it's like, Jesus, why didn't we just pay the extra few quid and put out this single, so at least we'd have this legacy. So we didn't have this legacy. So I suppose we sort of joked that there was a sort of a scratch there that needed to be, or an itch that needed to be scratched, and we wanted to put out this sort of single. So we sort of got to, myself and David, who was the guitarist in the Panic Merchants, we'd remained friends. So about 10 years ago, we sort of started writing songs together, and that's where we came up with this concept of the Sons of Southern Ulster. And we just did these, we wrote these songs remotely. I'm in the States and he was in Ireland, and we recorded them predominantly remotely. And next thing we knew, we had an album on our hands, and we sent it out to a few places, and we got good responses. It was, I think the first place we sent it to was a magazine in Britain called Vive le Rock, which is this kind of punk kind of magazine. And at that time, they were giving out a CD, a free CD. And we sort of thought, the zenith of everything that we have ever wanted would be to appear on this CD of Vive le Rock. So we sent it to Vive le Rock, and we didn't get any response for a few weeks. So we were like, oh, shit, obviously it's no good. And then about 2 months later, out of the blue, Viva La Rock got back onto us and said, "This is brilliant. This is fantastic. We put any of these songs on our CD." So it went from there. And I think that was probably just before we sort of put the album out. But that kind of gave us the impetus to put the album out. And at that time, we put it on a CD and we started to sell it. And then what happened was the response was so positive and from all over the place. And these songs, if you listen to the first album, the songs are very much rooted in this small town in Ireland and us growing up in the 80s. And they're very specific to a time period and a place. But it became obvious to us fairly early on that this resonated with people, and often people of a certain age, of people who'd watched Top of the Pops and sort of knew that kind of punk scene and that kind of stuff. And what we were trying to juxtaposition was this kind of weird living in rural Ireland in what was a weird time. The 80s and 70s and 80s in Ireland was a weird time, and you have to remember we were close to the border of Northern and Southern Ireland, and so it was just this bizarre sort of time to be living through. So we sort of juxtapose that with the mundanity of living in that kind of society, but also having this access to, in many ways, British TV and British media, where we were consumed by, as 12-year-olds, even though we lived in a town that was populated by, pubs and farmers and was very rural, we had access to the NME and Melody Maker and Old Grey Whistle Test and any of those shows that would when the Tube and all of that stuff. So we were seeing all this stuff and sort of absorbing it, and so we tried to capture that on the first album, and it seemed to work. And then there was a bit of a clamor for us to play live, and when we were asked to play live, we kind of were like, oh God, what do we do here, because we've never actually played these songs in reality. So we sort of had to then decide to play live, and that was interesting because we ended up getting we didn't have a band, so we ended up getting the original drummer and the original bass player from the Panic Merchants.
Yep.
So they were in the same sense as us. They'd moved on with their lives and they were doing their own thing, and they were eager to do it. And I remember the bass player, I hadn't seen him for nearly 30 years. And he'd actually moved to Australia, which I didn't know about. And I tracked down his email, and I sent him this email out of the blue. It's like, "Hey, Paddy, it's Justin from remember the Panic Merchants." So I didn't even know if he'd even remember who I was. And I sent him this email, and I said, "We put this album together. If you're interested in coming along and doing some bass on some of these live things, you're more than welcome to." And I put it in the mail to put it in the post to Paddy in Australia, and we didn't hear anything for a while, and then one day he just got back and he said, "Geez, I listened to the album and I was really impressed." And he said, "To be honest with you, when you said you were sending it, I was kind of dreading it, because I thought it would be sort of a bunch of old guys playing like Louie Louie and stuff."
Yeah.
So so Paddy then was on board. So then we ended up doing a short tour of Ireland. I think that was probably 2018 or so. And it was just great fun, and it was a real success, and it's sort of that was the start of it, and here we are. We brought out a second album last year, which has done really well, and it's sold out at this point. The vinyl has sold out, and we now find ourselves with this 4-track EP, or it's really a single, but it's a 4-track. It's the old school kind of. I remember buying when Nightboat to Cairo by Madness came out. That was the single, but it was actually an EP. There were like 4 tracks on it, or 3 or 4 tracks. So we were sort of thinking that way. But the reason we put it on vinyl was, well, there were a couple of reasons, but just through a mutual friend, Pete Briquette from the Boomtown Rats happened to pick up on our album and got in touch, which was quite amazing because I remember Pete Briquette, I don't remember him. I was a fan of the Boomtown Rats.
You were a fan of the Boomtown Rats, yeah.
So the first, as I've said to other people, the first single I ever bought was like clockwork. So Pete Briquette got in touch, and the funny thing about Pete Briquette is when the Boomtown Rats were big in around the world, or well, I don't know if they were ever big in America, but when they were big in Britain and they were having #1 hits, as a kid in Ireland, it was amazing to see this, because I think they were the first Irish band who were sort of contemporary, who went in and conquered, you know, Top of the Pops, and they got to number one. And, you know, I know a lot of people like to slag off Bob Geldof and stuff now with, you know, with the Live Aid and stuff. And, you know, he's an easy target. But for a while, he was the coolest guy in the world, I think. I remember he came out after they got to number one. I think it was with Rat Trap. And he ripped up a picture of, I was going to say the Pope, but that was Sinead O'Connor probably copying his idea. He ripped up a picture of John Travolta and Olivia Newton-John, who'd been number one forever. And so he was a very cool dude. But the funny thing about it is not only was it amazing that these guys were Irish, they were kind of like us, but one of them was from Cavan, the same rural county as us, which was Pete Burkett. And lo and behold, 30 years later, he hears us and he asks if it's, you know, he asked, is it okay if I mix some of your songs? And we're like just dumbfounded.
And you were like, no, you're not doing that. Yeah,
he
of course.
asked us, he sort of said, can we do this? And we said, sure. And he said, well, can you send us the stems? And we had to go, sure. And then we were like, what the hell are the stems? What's he even talking about? So we worked it all out anyway.
So let's quickly go through. You show me who's who here. Obviously, that handsome young chap in the front, that's me. The other guys here. Who have we got?
The guy behind the handsome young guy with the little square Rick Buckler style glasses.
Yep.
That is David Marr. He's the guitarist.
Lovely.
Then beside him, the other guy with the snazzy glasses is Paddy Glacken. He's the bass player who lives in Australia now. Was originally in the Panic Merchants.
Yep.
Then there's me. And then there's Noel Larkin. He's the drummer. Again, he was originally in the Panic Merchants. And so now we're...
Hi, guys.
They'll be listening in later on.
Yeah, at some stage. So you say that you weren't doing music for 20 odd years or whatever, but you would have been listening to music for that period and absorbing music.
Absolutely. And
yeah,
I became one of those kind of people who just, you know, goes to the record shop 5 days a week and buys albums and would spend hours upon hours in there and, you know, would buy everything and, you know, even buy stuff I didn't really like, but felt, well, I need to have this in the collection. And so really quite obsessed with music and all it was. So
are there any bits of music or bands or things that over that 20-year period have influenced or come out in terms of what you're doing now?
The funny thing is, I would say when I look for influences for you know, the lyric writing and the songs in general, it's funny because it seems most of the influences that we really take to heart are still the influences that we had
back then,
the 70s and the 80s. And I remember buying records in the 90s. And I got to be honest with you, there's very few records that I bought in the 90s that I would ever listen to. And I kind of look upon it. And I know this is a quick statement and people will, you know, well, what about this and what about that? But in general, I kind of thought, when I look back on it, it's not an era that really interests me that much. And the whole, like, the Manchester scene and that kind of stuff, I liked it at the time. And, you know, I thought the Stone Roses album was great and all that. But it wouldn't have any lasting impact on me. It's really, we go back and we, you know, obviously, you know, you're looking at the Sex Pistols, you're looking at Joy Division. From a lyrical standpoint, I'm sort of looking at people like, because what I do is kind of, I'm not really a singer. It's kind of some singing, but you know, there's a lot of talking and shouting and stuff. So I kind of look at John Cooper Clarke or Ian Jury, who kind of tell these little stories, and also the guy from Half Man, Half Biscuit, Nigel Blackwell, who just tells these amazing stories, and he kind of dresses them up as if they're. A lot of people just think his lyrics are jokey and they're a jokey band, but when you actually listen to his lyrics, yes, of course, there's a humor to them, but they just cut to the quick. There's a sadness and there's a sort of desolation in there, and he captures something. So they're the people kind of I would listen to. Look, that's not to say that, you know, there's not great bands since, and I don't sort of, you know, I haven't listened to any of the contemporaries, but really the influences are sort of embedded sort of in the back of my mind.
Mm.
You know,
I mean,
some of
you
the bands
mentioned
like that are-
storytelling there. You mentioned sort of storytelling and getting a story out. I mean, to some extent, that's folk as well, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it is. And in fact, when we first sent our songs to Vive la Rock, and they picked them for the CD, they described one of them, which was called the Pop In. It was like the hit off the first album, and I used the term hit loosely,
In
but
that sense.
so yeah. So
Yeah.
what they described it, they said we'd really like to put the space folk one on. And I'd never heard that term, space folk, but ever since then, we kind of, you know, whenever we're pushed into a corner where we need to know something about your band, and can you write a piece, or can we put a PR piece together? You know, we always come back to this space folk, and there's definitely a folky sense to what we're doing, and I kind of want to keep that there because it's something that we can do, and it's kind of unique. And I don't mean unique as in nobody else has ever done it, but our take on it's kind of unique. And we're not in the business of, or nor do we have any interest of writing pop songs with, you know, a chorus and a verse and a middle eight and that kind of, and not because we don't think they're good songs and they're valid, but it's just I don't think I could do that.
That's not what you do.
And I couldn't put my heart into that. So what I like about what we do is they're kind of they're contrary kind of songs, and they're songs and they're poems and they're stories, and it's all kind of mashed into one. And if you like it, you like it, and if you don't, you don't. And we don't really. I don't mean to be flippant, but we really don't care. We're not in this for the money. There's no money anyway, and you know. And the biggest problem we would have now is if some, you know, like if a record company came to us and said, which is what we dreamed about as kids, and said, "Hey, we'll put out your album." We'd be like, "No, it's you're okay," because we you know, it's just not something we're interested in. And I don't mean to be dismissive of people who are into that, but we have other things. I've got 3 kids. I've got a mortgage. You know, if a record company comes to me and says, "We look after your 3 kids and pay your mortgage and guarantee you a comfortable life for the rest of your life," well, then I might think about it. But I don't think that happens anymore.
No. And I still don't think you'd think about that in a way, because I think you'd be suspicious of that.
Yeah, well, I just wouldn't believe them. That's not the way it works.
It's not the way the world works, is it? So, you know. Oh, but what do you want to achieve? What do you want to achieve with your music? I mean, ultimately, you want to, like any musician, you want to have people out there that enjoy what you do and you know, get something from what you do. Is there more stories to tell?
I think there are, and I remember when we originally decided to do what we're doing, and we sort of, you know, we started singing about Bailieborough, where we grew up. There was this sort of sense of, it sounds very Spinal Tapish, but there was a kind of a sense that this is very much a concept, and we'd sort of hit on this idea of let's do a trilogy of albums and do 3 and see what comes of it. And you know, at that time, it was the 3 album idea was sort of a twinkle in the eye, really. And at this point now, we've got 2 down and sort of 1 to go. And when you say, what do we want to achieve? I think what I want to achieve, and I think the rest of the guys are in cahoots with this, is I'm of an age where I want to leave something behind that's meaningful. So I want, you know, the idea that somebody might go back to one of our albums in a few years or even now, and just find something that totally resonates and stops them in their tracks and sort of make a difference. And that's what I want. So we're not about huge sales or anything like that. And, you know, as we all know, huge sales don't really happen anymore. But that's not, in many ways, if you start getting into, you know, if you get into the commercial side of things, it kind of bastardizes everything that you're trying to do. And even at our very small level, we've sort of found that. And like, for example, when we brought out the last album and we put it on vinyl, it took off to an extent in that it sold very fast. And we had people all over going, how do I get the album? And then we put it on Bandcamp, and people are buying it, and I know we should be thrilled, but it's actually a pain in the neck, because then you've got to put it in a box and you've got to send it off to people. And instead of actually writing new music or thinking about it, now you're sort of stuck in this thing, and you start to second guess yourself. And you've got like DJs who play you, and then you've got other DJs who don't play you, and you're like, well, why aren't these guys playing us? And why are and you sort of get, your head kind of gets into this kind of business sense at a very small, very, very small level. But it's not fun. You think it's gonna, like, the first few times somebody goes, hey, your album's great, where can I get it? You're just so thrilled and so shocked that it's just amazing. But after a while, it becomes very mundane, and it becomes very like work. And
Yeah.
I don't want this to be work. I want to enjoy it, and I want it to be fun, and I want to do it on our own terms. But that's not to say that other people getting it is important. It's very important that other people get it. And
Yeah.
I don't care what artist you're talking to. Like I say this a bit like, oh, well, I don't care if anybody likes it or anybody doesn't like it. But if you produce something and everybody goes, that's crap, well,
Yeah.
that's not fun either. So it's
No.
nice to have people get it.
So you're quite happy that people can stream this.
Absolutely. Look, if you put it on Spotify or you put it on Bandcamp, and people pay 99 cents to get one of your songs, it's kind of pointless. Maybe if you're U2, it might be great, because you might add up to $1 million at the end of the day. But for us, you're adding up to, $40. So,
Yeah.
and it's like, to be honest, I don't even know where the money goes, because I can't even remember who set up the Bandcamp thing. But what I do like is the vinyl thing. The vinyl thing has actually been quite important to us, and I know it's a bit of a sort of a fashion thing nowadays that everyone's back into vinyl. But because we're of a certain age, there's a piece of us. If you remember, I'd said we always regretted that we never put out a 7-inch single back in the 80s when we were around. So we're still very much sort of in that headspace of, if it's not on vinyl, it's really not an album. And so it's important for us to sort of do that. So the Peeper Cat thing's on vinyl, and the second album's on vinyl, and we're now in the process of putting the first album belatedly on vinyl. So I kind of
And you never know, Justin, it may end up on C90 cassette as well.
There's a possibility that it might. In fact, I bought an old-fashioned cassette player the other day for my son, but he seems uninterested. So I'm sort of thinking I might make a few C90s myself, if I could find a C90. But I do have the cassette player, but it might end up on a mixtape or something.
Yeah,
But,
they're definitely making a comeback as well. Cassettes are definitely making a comeback, so we never know.
It seems ludicrous, and it really is quite ludicrous, because I seem to remember when cassettes were a thing. If I had an album on cassette, obviously I'm slightly obsessive here, but if I had an album on cassette, I didn't really feel I had the album. Like if somebody said, you have Sandinista, and I have it on cassette, I'd feel like I'm lying if I said yes, because it just didn't seem the same to me as a vinyl album.
Yeah, I know what you mean there.
And they were the kind of conversations you used to have, like, do you have Sandinista? And
yeah,
of course I do. So,
well, I've had that conversation on here before, that, once upon a time, many of us would have taken tapes to our friends' houses, and we would have taped other people's record collections and taken those tapes home to consume that music. But you would then go out and end up the ones that you really liked, you would end up buying them on vinyl, because you had to have it on vinyl, and the cassette would wear out. So it was actually, back then, that's where copying was actually, it wasn't killing music at all. There were all of the adverts at the time about, copying's killing music. It never ever killed music. It actually just made us buy more.
Well, the only people who were going to the effort of taping albums were people who were music consumers. And I think they probably sold more albums that way, because, if you remember, I'm sure it was the same for you as it was for me, that when I was a kid, there wasn't that much money around. So if you bought an album, that was an event. and God forbid you didn't like it. So you'd kind of have to know a few bits and pieces about it before you bought it. So the cassette helped. And I suppose that's where radio helped back in the day, where you'd sort of get to hear, you might hear it on. We didn't really get John Peel in Ireland, but we had an equivalent, a guy called Dave Fanning, and he would sort of play, album tracks. So you'd be able to sort of get a sense of what it was like. Because if you remember, before the internet, you couldn't hear any of this stuff. So I bought albums when I was a kid that they were terrible, but I listened to them endlessly because I bought them, and that was just the way it was. So I think that the taping thing was great. It sort of allowed you to make at least an educated purchase.
It did. Justin, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you this afternoon. As I say, we've got an EP out at the moment. When's an album due?
Well, we've just really started. We brought out the last album, Sinners and Lost Souls, last summer. So we're in the process of sort of demoing songs for this new album. The last album did take a number of years, so this one could take a number of years.
No, never know.
Any time now. We have the luxury of taking our time with these things. So I'm 56 years of age. I hope it's out before I'm 60. So
there we go.
In peace.
Well, we'll hold you to that then, Justin.
Okay.
In the meantime, if people want to get hold of the EP, they can still get hold of that on Bandcamp, and they can. Yeah, and do they order vinyl for the previous versions on Bandcamp as well?
On Bandcamp, you can buy the Sinners and Lost Souls album on vinyl, and we will very soon be putting up a link for vinyl for this new EP, the Turf Accountant Schemes EP. So both
Lovely.
are on vinyl, and stay tuned for the first album, Foundry Folk Songs. That should be out in the next 6 months.
Lovely. Brilliant. Justin, it's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Graham. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye for now.